So good morning. I'm Sarah, and I'm here with Arjay. We're going to talk about AI art. I'm sorry we tweaked the title just a little bit, as we found AI art is often overlooked in discourse in libraries. So here we have a brief overview. We're going to go over some history, some major ethical issues, and end with some ideas of what we can do.
All right, so just how do these all work anyway? Generative art programs operate via neural networks that use math to combine neurons into one large network, pattern conceptually similar to a human brain. A neuron is an input combined with an output, in this case, one part image, one part text caption. There are two major types used in generative AI art programs, a GAN, or generative adversarial network, and a diffusion model. GANs train two neural networks on data sets composed of these image-text pairs. One tries to pass two images to the other, one real, one fake. If the fake is identified, it tries again until the other network can't tell which is the fake. That ends up being the GAN's output. GANs are very good at human faces. For instance, this person does not exist.com that you can see on the right. Diffusion models, on the other hand, work by starting with one image, introducing noise until it's a mass of pixels, and then tries to go back and rebuild what it can remember out of the noise. Most of the more powerful image generators nowadays use diffusion, but there's still GANs out there, and we're not sure if there's some strange blends around the generative AI space. Models are proprietary, and some of the more powerful ones guard their models carefully. Both of these types consume huge amounts of data paired with text, in most cases a Layan 5-beat data set. This is an open source data set which has over 5 billion pairs of text plus image. Both of them also use natural language processing to identify and connect images that fit all of the given prompts, then reassemble an image to fit the prompts. As you can imagine, this is computationally intensive and thus very expensive. Computer-generated art itself stretches back further than we think. This quote here, which I won't read out loud, leaves a lot of room for interpretation. So I'd like to stress that we are going to focus only on generative AI art, autonomously designed art created by artificially intelligent systems. A timeline of this can stretch back to the 1960s, but we're going to make this fast and simple. From 2015's Google Deep Dream to the explorations of text-generated GANs like Ryan Moulton's 2021 Tour of the Sacred Library, these have been followed by the more tech-savvy of the digital world, but have largely gone unnoticed by the general public. It's only since 2022 that this has really accelerated, and that started with the previously mentioned Layan 5-beat dataset. Within a month of its release, OpenAI releases DALL-E 2, and other diffusion models like Midjourney proliferated from there. It's only been since last October that DALL-E 3 and thus Copilot have moved to integrating their generative art programs into a multimodal chat interface. What I really want you to take away from here is that this tech hasn't come out of nowhere. Everything we're seeing has been building for almost a decade. On to the tools. So first up on our notable tools is one of our two leaders, DALL-E 3. This is the flagship model available from OpenAI, bundled completely with ChatGPT for $20 a month. Fast, efficient, but it also tries to rewrite your prompt to better fit internal guidelines. Users are granted ownership rights to generated art, allowing for commercial use, technically. There's more to this, which we will discuss later. Interestingly, DALL-E 3 generates pictures in the web-friendly WebP format. If you've ever had to struggle with editing these, you can actually ask it to convert the file to a JPEG, PNG, GIF, and you can even animate it. Technically, really technically. Copilot Image Creator is an offshoot of DALL-E 3. Microsoft owns 49% of all of OpenAI's profits due to an earlier investment, so they've also got access to the engine, despite being competitors. Copilot is much more accessible than DALL-E proper. Most people tie their Microsoft logins to their computers, so there's a minimum of heavy lifting to access Copilot. But there's some trade-offs. Less fast images a day, it's a weaker model, it's incapable of doing things like altering the aspect ratio. It's also had historically tight and eccentric censorship, which has left users mystified. And the other big drawback, Microsoft does not give you ownership rights. Though DALL-E 3 has received a large amount of attention, Midjourney is one of its best-known competitors. Operating off of a proprietary diffusion engine, Midjourney has won art contests, replicated artists, and become the focus of multiple lawsuits. However, out of all the tools available here, Midjourney is one of the hardest to use. There's no free version. It charges you based on the processing time, and it's also a purely chat-based program that uses the chat program Discord. Midjourney does have two unique commands that are not immediately evident from other tools, such as blend, you can mix together two images, and describe, which writes prompts based on your image. You do have ownership rights with the caveat that large companies that make more than $1 million USD must have an advanced plan to be able to own their assets. Firefly is Adobe's foray into the Gen AI market. You get free generation, but you can also spend more on the Adobe suite and get bundled in with things like Photoshop. This is very interesting because Firefly is the ethical alternative to DALL-E and Midjourney. And by this, I mean they use Adobe stock and training data, and they will supposedly ignore images with a do not train credential, and they have operated compensation models. Longtime familiar users of Adobe don't trust Adobe, but at least they're paying lip service to the ethics. Because of this, they're unlikely to copy someone else's style or intellectual property. But the trade-off here is that makes them much less powerful than its competitors. Firefly was explicitly designed for commercial use. Free users still have to contend with watermarks. So we're going to pivot to ethics. It's hard to get an appreciation for censorship on these programs. Most discourse I've seen about it is that censorship is an important component of controlling the technology. I draw your attention to one of my favorite works of art, Nude Descending a Staircase #2 by Marcel Duchamp. This got me in trouble with Midjourney as I tried to convert one image into something more reminiscent of this painting. The title nude, despite having nothing objectionable, was enough for them to block my request. Microsoft also has had some trouble with over-tuned shackling and censorship. This is the dog and has a bit of a hate following online. For a while, Copilot censorship was severely overtuned and would block you for any reason. Capybaras, Hulk, Ghost, skeletons, spooky, which was a problem during Halloween. I've also seen someone try to recreate the dog with prompts and got the dog, so mission failed successfully. Every so often, Microsoft changes their post-training filter, new set of prompts are censored and others aren't. I want to posit that the censorship isn't woven from moral fiber. It is opportunistic, it is profit-based, it has an eye on quarterly revenue. Put little stock into their moral decisions. Better question, why are we giving tech companies this level of power over our morality? What happens when suddenly they decide that gay rights affect their bottom line? Now they're banned. And I'd like to explore the concept of the taboo in art. As it stands with the current state of censorship, AI art literally cannot make Michelangelo's David. He's naked. Or Picasso's Guernica, violence. The taboo is a fundamental part of art, and these tools try to excise it and still believe that they're on the same level.
So another main issue here is data scraping. So data scraping is also commonly known as web scraping, and it's when data is extracted from the web or other sources. And it's technically illegal if you scrape data publicly available on the internet. However, as we'll see, copyrighted and private personal information often also get collected. Data laundering is when stolen data is transformed or the provenance is obscured so that it can be sold. In the case of AI, data was originally scraped for non-commercial purposes explicitly, so research only, but then at a later date, it was used commercially. So there's an argument that this is data laundering, as the companies used copyrighted materials to train their models. This especially affects artists, which I'll discuss in detail later. A way to check if your work has been used to train AI models is using haveibeentrained.com. So besides many artists finding their work in various data sets, one woman here in this image found her private medical records in the Leon 5B data set. And unfortunately, there's no way to remove your images from a model once they've been seen. You can opt out of future training by adding your images or domains to haveibeentrained.com's do not train registry or some of the models opt-out options. But since the technology is open access, this really doesn't stop private users of these technologies from adding any images they want to their models. There are some companies claiming to have ethically trained AI, like Adobe Firefly and Getty, who use their own stock images. However, this has issues as both contain copyrighted materials and materials generated using Midjourney, as well as Adobe contributors only finding out after the AI was trained that their content was used. So you can see in the screenshot from Adobe stock, there are some copyrighted images that can be used in particular circumstances. There's an editorial note on it. It's not really clear if they're being used or not to be trained. I want to draw your attention to another set of images from Adobe stock. Just for the sake of being quick, I'll just say, like, think in your head, like, which one of these do you think is generated by AI? And then I'll move to the next image here. They both were, but only one, this first one here, was tagged as it. And I believe that's probably because it was in the title there. The other one was not tagged as such probably because it wasn't in the title. I will go over how to like pick these out, but you can see too that these would be in the training data. So another ethical issue is style mimicry and appropriation. So many artists have vocally protested AI art, and for good reason. Though some newer models forbid using specific artists and prompts, you can still upload whatever images you want to create similar ones, like Midjourney has this option. These images then are in the data set and can't be unseen. So one contemporary digital artist that is copied and prompted the most, besides Picasso, is Greg Rutkowski. When you Google him, many of the images that come up are not actually created by him. So he's an example of an artist that chose to opt out, but is still being added to private models against his will. Another artist, Kim Jung-ji, had a model trained from his work after his death. And ironically, in this tweet, you can see that the creator of the model asked for credit. Another issue is fake Indigenous art and appropriation. So here I have a slide deck from Slides Carnival with a sort of mishmash of Native stereotypes in like AI-generated art. Companies have also been caught using AI-generated Indigenous art instead of actually paying Indigenous artists to license their pieces. And here I have an example of a group that used an AI-generated image of an Aboriginal woman on their site. So again, this is not a real person. It's now been replaced with an Adobe stock image, you can see. So there are a couple of, I just see in the chat here, there are a couple of tools that have been developed for artists to try and fight back. There's Glaze and Nightshade. So just very simply, Glaze helps reduce direct replication of style, and Nightshade essentially poisons the data set by adding unrelated images. So I don't know how well these are working right now, though, as I know programmers pretty much right away started developing antidotes. Another interesting way to fight back that some people have been doing is trying to draw the ire of notoriously copyright protective properties like Disney by selling merchandise with AI art created from their images. We'll have to see if this is more effective. So now about copyright. So far, AI art is not copyrightable, though different models have different statements about this. As Arjay mentioned, here's just like a couple of examples. So an interesting thing is there was a comic that used AI art. It was Zarya of the Dawn, and here's like a little shot of some of the panels. And it was originally granted copyright, and then that copyright was revoked. Because currently products seeking copyright must be human-made. So this is currently US copyright law, and there's a caveat for fair use involving transformative use. The Canadian copyright law is similar. Basically, if the content is transformed to some degree or used in certain contexts, it can be used without copyright infringement. So AI art supporters often argue that the diffusion process is in itself transformative. There's also sort of like cognitive-based arguments of like, you know, inspiration, artist versus AI art generator. But there's really no legal precedence regarding this yet. There have been some recent copyright cases in the fine arts world, though, that might influence some of the current AI art lawsuits in the future. One pretty big one is the Andy Warhol Prince photo. So he used this photograph and made a bunch of silkscreen copies of it. And this was tied up in the courts for quite a while, and it was deemed not transformative enough. And the Andy Warhol institution has to, the photographer won a settlement against them, essentially. So we'll see how that influences AI art lawsuits. So another major issue is the ease of which AI can generate and spread disinformation. Some of this comes from inherent biases ingrained in the models. They're scraping the internet and therefore all the terrible things on the internet. There's a tool called Stable Diffusion Bias Explorer, which has been used to demonstrate these biases in AI art generators. So here's a particularly offensive one of associating Africans with poverty. The prompt here was an African man and his fancy house, and that's what came up. There's another example of doctors all being depicted as white men and nurses as women. Stable Bias Explorer discovered essentially, a positive bias towards whiteness and masculinity. And AI is notoriously doesn't recognize the faces of people of color as well. There's another one here we can see of an earlier model depicting Latinas in not safe for work content. And there's a later cleaned up version. There's a lot of issues with sexualizing the ethnicities of women. There's also the issue of just distilling people and cultures to stereotypes. So besides this, there's the issue of fake images being circulated as real. Here are a couple of fake images. And this one here of the Pope in a Balenciaga puffer. So I suppose relatively innocuous, but here's the more harmful one of the Pentagon being bombed. And this actually had real world effect, causing stock market $500 billion. So right now, not everyone is able to spot these fake images. And frankly, they're getting harder and harder to spot. So this has frightening implications, is when people can't distinguish fake from real, you can end up denying anything or, editing history as you wish.
Okay, so we don't have too much time, so I'll try to burn through this. So what needs to be done? One of my research interests is in the ethical use of technology. There's a concept called the Collingridge dilemma from the 1980s. This states there's a two-horn problem with controlling tech. When the cost of control is low, we don't understand enough about the tech to do anything about it. When we do know enough, the cost is too high. There's a sweet spot, but I think they're pretty close to that inflection point. As a profession, there's literally not much we can do as we are now. We're very far behind in the knowledge curve that technology has been passing us by. The most important thing we can do is learn as much as possible, educate each other to form a unified response. Ethical AI advocacy is another aspect I think we should move towards in the generative AI art space. Let's advocate for watermarking content, create telltale image metadata. These are two things we can push for. Another thing we can do is teach our patrons some basic visual literacy. Librarians haven't often thought about visual literacy, and now that we're dealing with this problematic material, it's more important than ever. Next slide gives us some quick guidelines. So we're going to go quickly through here. Most of us have by now figured out the best way AI art is through the hands, but you can also determine it by looking at lines. Note the way that the lines in this rendering of the Golden Gate Bridge disappear into nothing or mysteriously double.
So if you examine the metadata, often AI generated images are square, like perfectly square. 1024 by 1024, we've got a couple of aspect ratios. They're common ones that are kind of like red flags. Also looking at the title of the image is an indicator if it sounds like a prompt. Anything that says in the style of is like a big indicator. So evaluating the source of an image is just as important as it is for other sources. So have a look at who posted the art, what they've posted. Do they have a suspicious affiliation, or like what kind of authority do they have? So here I have an image of the aftermath of the Great Cascadia earthquake and tsunami that hit the Pacific Northwest in 2001. And if no one remembers that, that's good because it didn't happen. So those were a series of images that showed up on Reddit. And here's a pretty innocuous image of George Bush meeting with the mayor of Tacoma, Washington after the fake disaster. I think it's really hard to detect that this is AI. Like, it looks like pretty generic image. If you do a reverse image search though, and in case anyone hasn't used it, it's that little button there, you press it and you upload your image, and you can see, usually you can find the exact source of the image. So you can look at and see where it came from. So our final note to you guys is to urge you to play with these technologies yourself, because the more exposed you are, the easier it is to pick out AI generated content. And really, like, you know, the more you follow like these issues, like the better you're going to be able to advise students.
And here's our selected references. Thank you all very much.
And we have a copy of this PowerPoint that we can make available to people.